Welcome back to my final video in this series. My name is Courtney, I'm an anthropology student, and we are talking about Victorian mourning. Today's topic is about symbolism found within Victorian mortuary practices that goes beyond grave markers, but it's mostly about grave markers. Funerals, if you don't already know, are quite expensive, even within the Victorian period. Nowadays, there are funeral directors who will contact the necessary parties for you, make the arrangements, and in general make the whole process a lot easier on the grieving family. However, the position of funeral director only came into being in the late 19th century. Prior to the popularity of utilizing a funeral director, the family would have to contact a very extensive list of people. This list includes, quote, cabinet makers who make coffins, layers of the dead, often women who prepared corpses for viewing and burials, sextons who oversaw more public aspects of funeral rituals such as supplying coffins and appropriate accoutrements, tolling church bells, digging graves, and presiding over funerals and interments, and municipal officers such as coroners, superintendents of burial grounds, and registrars of deaths, end quote. The castle's household guide details the cost of the funeral depending on how many bells and whistles you want thrown in. Those bells and whistles include the level of detail on the coffin hardware, how many attendants you want for the coffin and the guests, whether you want silk lining for the coffin or extra pillows, and how many horses you want to pull the carriages. The list for the more expensive funeral is pretty pomp and circumstance, if you can imagine it. The guide also warns that the cost of the funeral does not factor in that you have to buy a new wardrobe for the entire family, as everyone will be in mourning clothes for a good year or more. This all ties into the beautification of death trend that was popular during the Victorian period. It meant a more prolonged and ritualized mourning period, which has resulted in more artifacts for archaeologists and historians to analyze. One thing we can analyze is the coffin hardware, and another is the grave markers themselves. So what is coffin hardware? Well, it's basically all the little things that hold the coffin together, such as the nails, the screws, the hinges, the lid holders, and the tacks that are used to keep the coffin lining fabric in place, and so on and so on. The thing about coffin hardware is that it's the parts of the coffin, not including the body inside, that are the most likely to survive. Wood breaks down as it rots, and fabrics also decay quite rapidly if they're unprotected, which is why in my last video I talked about us not being able to find gorgeous Victorian gowns super easily, because they just don't get buried. Coffin hardware, while it may rust, is typically made of some sort of metal, meaning it fares better in the soils than the rest of the coffin. Some archaeologists argue that coffin hardware is a status indicator, but there is more and more evidence suggesting that this belief needs to be reviewed, as it became a popular trend and even individuals of lower status and income tried to replicate their peers. The trend of elaborately designed coffin hardware started with the wealthy upper-class individuals, but as it became more popular, industrial techniques of replicating the designs occurred, which meant that affordable options became more common with cheaper costs. Among all the bells and whistles that one could add to the coffin, decorative handles, plaques, hinges, etc., a trend emerged where a glass seeing plate would be installed on the coffin so that the mourners could see the face of the deceased. The local coffin maker would create them using leftover window pane stock. Their popularity, the result of the beautification of death trend, is shown by the fact that it was very widespread, spanning both decades and countries. My source spends about half a page listing some of the sites in Canada and the US where this has been found. Both the poor and the rich had access to these different forms of coffin hardware. The only difference is in the materials and how widespread the design was. Just like commissioning a painting, one could commission an artist to create specific coffin hardware, which was achievable for the rich. But for the poor, the Industrial Revolution meant that mass-produced, cheaper goods were widely available, and judging from the examples that Bell gave, people definitely took advantage of this. So now, on to grave markers. For starters, I will be mostly talking about headstones, and if you notice that I switched the terms, it is for a good reason. There are many different types of grave markers, one of which is headstones. Headstones are, you guessed it, at the head of the grave. And there are also footstones, which are located at the foot of the grave. Fences made of metal or stone can also be built around the grave, which is especially common in family plots. However, there's such a thing called a Kerbset, which is another type of fence, only this is meant for individual graves. I've seen a couple of these myself, and I have to say it is not fun to trip over these when you're walking in snow. One of my sources explains that Kerbsets could also come in the more affordable option of an earthen mound instead of a stone fence border, and that it is frequently mistaken for a fresh grave. The style of marker and whether a Kerbset or a footstone is also there all depends on where the person was buried, both within the cemetery and within the world, when they were buried, how much was spent, and the kinds of trends popular at the time. Buckham mentions that memorials, which refers to memorialization artifacts found within cemeteries, acts as a class and status marker. My family has a bit of background in doing some installation of monuments in cemeteries, and the level of details that go into the monuments really does explain the cost. The more detailed the monument, the larger the size, and the location within the cemetery can all affect the price tag. As I mentioned with the coffins, the popularity of this trend also means that cheaper options become available so that the lower classes can emulate the upper classes' ideals of the beatification of death. It eventually becomes a cycle of trends, starting with the elite, making their way to the middle class, and then becoming common and falling out of fashion. Looking at specific recurring motifs and finding the links to social affiliations, Buckham suggests that it was done to, quote, maintain a sense of individuality, end quote. In my experience, most of the headstones that I have dealt with had either similar materials or some similar images, for example, a granite cross, but the style of the monument, its size, the type of engraving, what was engraved, and all other aspects of the monument were all unique to that individual. The ones that were most similar or identical were typically those of the same family buried in a specific time period. In my last video, I talked about a 19th century private cemetery located in Virginia, USA. In the cemetery, there were, quote, 15 marked headstones, several of which were associated with footstones. All except 2 bore dates of death. In addition, 6 small, unmarked, red sandstone slabs were assumed to be grave markers, end quote. The authors of this study noted that the grave markers did vary by size, but that variance was more to mark familial relations than any other factors such as status. 6 of the grave markers were carved by one of the patriarchs, and the epitaphs on them were composed by another singular family member. Returning back to Buckham, what they found in their analysis of the headstones of a York cemetery is that the 2 most common social group affiliations found on memorials were religious and childhood death. It is the shape of the marker, for example, in a cross, and the religious motifs found on the markers that were used to link the individual to a specific faith. For example, here's an Orthodox cross, and I've been to many cemeteries where this is one of the most common crosses found within it all, which indicates that they are all followers of the same faith. What is interesting about the childhood death memorials is that there have been a number of them found that are basically like miniaturized versions of the regular headstones. Not all of the childhood death stones are miniature, but it is interesting to note that one of the ways the Victorians memorialized the loss of a small child was with an equally small monument. Buckham suggests that commemoration of childhood death changed the spatial landscape of York Cemetery, as towards the mid-19th century more care was taken in the memorialization of children. Buckham also mentions the fact that a different color scheme was typical for childhood deaths, and white marble was the one that was most commonly used. The color white was commonly used to mark the death of a youth. For example, crepe and a ribbon was tied to the door of the house where a death had happened, and the different color combinations kind of marked like what the age of the deceased was, and white crepe with a white ribbon usually indicated a youth's death. Symbolism is really important to the Victorians, and the symbols placed on grave markers were carefully chosen to reflect the individual, their life, their interests, their relationships, etc. These grave markers were meant to be a symbol of who the person was, and accuracy was important to ensure that the deceased was properly remembered. Quote, the way a person is represented by a mourning object is often an idealized version, a type of wish fulfillment and reinterpretation, end quote, by the mourners tasked with choosing or creating the objects, typically women. But the thing is, it is really expensive to carve a monument, especially a larger one, so symbols were created to take the place of words or phrases. And before I give some examples, I want to mention that some archaeologists caution against using singular interpretations on mortuary designs, as, quote, specific icons often had multiple meanings that help shape dynamic class, ethnic, and religious identities, end quote. Some of the details and meaning behind the symbols are quite interesting. For example, clasped hands have multiple meanings depending on the style of the sleeves. quote, men wore straight cuffs and women wore lace or puff ones, end quote. Or the positioning, are their spouse leading another because they had died before the other, or it's a farewell from beyond the grave. Latin phrases and shortened biblical passages were common, and most of the Latin phrases had to do with death, specifically reminders that we will all die, or remember to cherish life. The death reminders could also come in the form of images on the graves, such as graphic depictions of rotting bodies or skeletons. As many already know, lamps were commonly used to mark the graves of childhood deaths. There are multiple types of angel motifs. A weeping angel was supposed to symbolize an untimely death. Meanwhile, one pointing downwards was not an indication that they were going to purgatory. Rather, it symbolized a sudden death, or that the deceased was pointing down from heaven in kind of like a watching over their loved ones kind of way. Pointing up meant that the angel was leading the deceased to heaven. Flowers, and especially roses, are really intricate in their meaning. Here's a quote that summarizes it nicely. Quote, roses usually adorn the graves of young women, and they duly represent heavenly perfection and earthly passion. If the rose is broken, it indicates the deceased's age. A broken bud means the girl was under 12 years old when she died. A partial bloom represents death during teenage years. A full bloom represents someone in the prime of their life. Joined or intertwined rosebuds depict a bond between mother and child. If you see these, it may mean a mother who died in childbirth. End quote. Portraits are also somewhat common and frankly really cool. They can be carvings in stones or actual photographs of the deceased, although not all were added during the Victorian period. I have taken a couple photos myself of these, and usually the photo may have been taken during the Victorian period, but the person died way after in the Edwardian period. But it's still really cool to see these kinds of photographs because you get to get a glimpse into what the person really looked like. Of course, there are other ways of memorializing the dead, and if you haven't seen it already, please check out my last video where I discuss hair art and jewelry. Samplers were another way to commemorate the deceased. They are, from my understanding, and it's not great, an embroidered portrait. Samplers would be placed in the parlor, a social space of the home, used especially for visitors. The intention of putting them in such a public space worked to remind the younger generations of those who had passed, and to demonstrate the family's loyalty to their beliefs surrounding faith and commemoration to their community should they enter their home. I want to emphasize that for the Victorians, grief and the process of grieving was important. It was understood that following these practices allowed the person to heal from their grief. This is not to say that the deceased should be forgotten once the mourners have finished their grieving periods, for you could finish the public mourning periods, the dressing stages from my last video, but still grieve privately in home. The parlor was a special part of the home where memento mori artifacts would be stored, such as hair wreaths, samplers, and in memoriam cards. I think this quote sums up this video quite nicely. Quote, within the rituals of mourning, the most ordinary objects were transformed into highly symbolic and significant pieces. End quote. So that was it for today. I just want to thank you for joining me on this journey, learning about how the Victorians dealt with death by looking at the archaeological record. Bye! 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 Thank you, bye! 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 No. Bye! Better-ish. Or it's a farewell, huh? Clasped hands have multiple meaning. For example, clasped, oh.
Clasped hands have multiple meanings depending on
Clasped. Oh Lord.